Welcome to the Toldinstone Podcast. I'm Garrett Ryan, and my guest today is Dr. Luke Lavan, lecturer in archaeology at the University of Kent. Dr. Lavan, welcome to the program.
Great to be here.
Oh, thanks so much. Today, we're going to talk about Roman cities in late antiquity, how they changed, why they often shrank, and how they were impacted by the arrival of Christianity. So, without any further ado, it might be helpful to begin by defining the period. For the purposes of your research, Dr. Lavan, what are the limits of late antiquity chronologically?
Oh, well, that's of course an interesting question. So I've got my eye on a number of different things. Have got my eye on the wider political history, and it does make sense to bring in the Islamic invasions as the end point, particularly the conquest of Egypt, which was a turning point. And of course, then the recovery from the 3rd century. But in terms of where that begins, in terms of cities, it really varies. I mean, we see many things happening at different speeds in different regions. But I would say I'm increasingly being pushed to around 250 because although Diocletian is maybe the business for a lot of people, he has impressive reforms that seem to stick. We get some of that serious alterations in the urban fabric starting from around that time, whether it's under Probus or whether it's under Claudius Gothicus or Aurelian. It's a little bit earlier. Sometimes the recovery is a little bit earlier, as well as the destructive events that take place at that time. So yeah, I mean, you could argue that there's other breaks of the periods which are interesting. Some people would like the reconquest of Justinian to usher in a new phase in the West. I'm not like that. I tend to see recovery happening before Justinian arrives back. But anyway, the main start and end, it's probably 250 to 650 for me. That's the most comfortable boundaries. With a little bit of an exception for the Near East. With the Umayyads, you can give another century. Things look very late antique under the Umayyads in cities.
Right. I guess the lesson here is the danger of periodization, or applying the same periodization across the empire, was such a different experience from west to east. Where antiquity and
I'm not an advocate of regional specialization always. It's a very good way of organizing your career. You represent Roman Gaul or Roman Africa, and you get to know all that material. Roman Asia Minor, but I think you miss things by doing that because you're mainly dealing with patterns of visibility, not real differences in between regions. But nevertheless, it is true that many processes, whether economic, religious, political, start at different times in different places, and so require sometimes different explanations from us. The catch-all explanations don't stand up to scrutiny. When you consider this divergence that occurs. Yet there are things which do happen everywhere, which are imperial processes, which we need to note. So there is a story, I think, to tell of late antiquity rather than just late antiquities.
Yes, so an important caution, right? Trying to complement those two stories, the regional ones and the empire-wide developments that we see happening site to site.
And sometimes people, as Fergus Miller argued, there are things to consider across imperial boundaries, where we share a basic urban culture, whether we're in each side of Mesopotamia, we don't want to imagine that the Roman frontier is something which is impermeable. Yes, it's not.
Right, yeah, all important points. So I guess with all those caveats in mind, taking those 4 centuries, more or less, as our window of discussion in this podcast. I guess, speaking again very globally, what are some challenges of investigating late antique levels in archaeological sites?
Well, a big question. Now that can be broken into 3 categories. One is about the formation of the record. The next is about how it's been transformed through time, through processes since antiquity. And then the last one is about how it's been recorded. So we could probably get through the last 2 fairly quickly. So, late antiquity has been a dirty word for some since the Enlightenment. It seems to present to us the opposite of the society which we're aspiring to. So it's been associated I think falsely, with economic failure or also of being a single overwhelming cultural political intolerance, which I think is also overdone. So people have tended to rush on late antique levels, often trying to get down to earlier ones, even removing late antique structures. We're still doing it in restoration. People will try to restore the first, second centuries AD and will remove the late stuff. They will record it now, but maybe not so seriously. So there's that issue. It's more important in some countries than others. We've also got a mania for restoration, which can involve not just fancy architecture, but also basic walls. So a wall of mortared rubble is replaced by a modern one. There's no archaeology left. And that's a common experience across the Balkans. You get many sites where there really is no archaeology left to see. It was on the photographs, but now you've got some sort of, replica for the tourists. And we find that if this process isn't done well, as typically it isn't, there's no records of those walls taken, no laser scanning or no photogrammetry, just a few rough drawings, sometimes done after they've left the site. And there's no attempt to find any materials that may be falling out of those walls, so dating is missed. So yeah, these are common problems. Of the second category, the category of survival, well, we've got overbuilding, haven't we? So I think one of the areas of greatest urban continuity long-term is northern Italy, but of course we have northern central Italy, modern successful cities on top. We would like to know what they look like in the 9th century. We get some opportunities, but we don't get to walk around them like we do around Ephesus. In other places, we've got a horizon where we've got really good preservation because it's been a sudden event, like abandonment. So we've got that in Ephesus, in Sagalassos for the 7th century, different forms of abandonment. And then this has you've also got a wave of prosperity, which is sometimes at the end of antiquity. So it's very obvious in Palestine. It's less obvious in Asia Minor, where there is a lot of building in the second half of the 6th century, which makes the place just quite mucky building, or early 7th century, for various reasons. And that creates a distorted impression. And for a long time, we didn't really tell the story of the 5th to 6th century in Asia Minor. We concentrate on a few inscriptions. And now we can see we've got a lot of evidence that's actually obscuring the state of the 4th century city. So that's an issue of preservation. And then, of course, you've got the, I've just touched on it there. The last category is how the record's been formed. There's processes in antiquity, which mean that certain things are visible, other things are not. And certain habits over time that are not static, such as the production of inscriptions, whether they be monumental inscriptions or personal graffiti, which tends to be much later, these will vary throughout time. So those, before you even get started on your dig, present you with a series of problems. So don't just look at a city and think that you can see a late antique city. It's a complex palimpsest of many different problems which you need to get to work on.
So even for a visitor, let alone archaeologist, sites require very careful reading. I know that when I was first at Ephesus, for example, you see the grand 2nd century city. And I knew from my reading, of course, that much of it had been profoundly changed in late antiquity. But as a visitor, you just see that one burnished surface, and it's hard to look beyond that unless you're consciously making that effort to see late antique city. Or that's true in many sites across the Mediterranean, as you said. Is there any... Oh, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, and I've published an article on Ephesus recently on this problem. You'll see an image going around the internet which shows the embolos in colour. It's supposed to be. This is supposed to be the early imperial city.
Right.
So it's aiming to be like you probably know the plastic model in Rome, which shows Rome in the 4th century, but no churches are allowed because churches are not Roman.
Right.
Well, for Ephesus, we've got this supposed 2nd century reconstruction of looking down the embolos. Nearly everything you can see is the late 6th to early 7th century. Right. And that's the portico. That's because, yes, in the late antique period, people do build porticos. They do have secular public space. The paving is early 5th century, and then there's some early 7th century paving even later. There's a lot of problems in how people interpret sites, and it's often because the actual documentation on those sites and the interpretive material is 50 years out of date. I mean, Ephesus, they're slowly getting around to re-educating the visitor, but it's only really at Sagalassos where they have got a firm grip on the later period and are showing that to the public in a balanced manner.
And I was going to ask you actually if there was one site you thought that did a good job of showing the evolution of a city over time. And so Sagalassos, you think they've done a pretty good job?
Yeah. In recent years, we've started to see some of the late walls being removed along the west side of the Upper Agora, for example, and a cleaner, earlier city being produced, which I think is a shame. But there are still some encroachment walls on the streets. That's good. There has been efforts to try and understand the statuary and how it's moved over time. So that I mean, Scythopolis, there's been a lot of preservation in situ of fallen walls, but I mean, how do you preserve a site which has been destroyed with earthquake with all these layers? What you end up doing is you end up preserving stone remains rather than. So it's always going to be, excavation is destructive. It's always going to be interpretive business. We've got to have to remove something. But can we keep enough there to tell a story? That's the challenge, isn't it?
Well, yes, I remember seeing Scythopolis the first time, and all those columns lying across the street, a very dramatic illustration of that, 8th century earthquake that leveled so much of the city.
I think
but usually it's just clearing the street, right? No worries, of course. It's the slight delay of making it easy for tourists to walk around and not think too hard about this century after century of rebuilding and reconfiguration. Something to think with. So moving on to something you said earlier about these horizons, events that we can see recorded in the records sometimes. Across the Mediterranean world, as we know, many Atlantic cities suffer disasters, which range from invasion and sacking to plague, for example. How visible are disasters like these in the record, and how can we kind of parse what kind of disasters they really are from the remains?
Well, that's difficult. I mean, if you're looking at one site, you will see one set of things. If you're looking at all sites, you will see others. So I think you can see the impact of the political success and failure of the late empire and the overall pattern of building. From my book, I did some charts, hundreds of examples, maybe a couple thousand examples of building, and their dating, getting rid of the poorly dated ones. The 4th century, like in the countryside, is a period of recovery everywhere. Forget the decline of the Curial Order. We're talking about a fiscal issue. I don't think it's a serious problem beyond the 3rd century. I think that the Curia are relatively stable. They're just not well funded, but they're stable. And then you see a crack in the last quarter of the 4th century. Things are going down, and they could fall through the floor in the second quarter of the 5th century, and there's no building except in Rome and Constantinople, no secular public building. And then you see a recovery in the east, not in the west, not till the very early 6th century. And in that again reaches a peak in the second half of the 6th century. And then you see a drop off in the 7th. And that would seem to be, maybe there's a drop off in the late 6th century, last quarter, but not the 3rd quarter. I can't see plague from that. I can see prolonged impact of war and the fiscal stress that puts on cities, and maybe on the price of building work. If the emperor's not doing a lot of secular public building, it's just walls, and he's confiscated all the builders, you can't get yourself a portico done as cheaply. Anyway, I can see that as a macro scale. And a micro scale, well, I'm one of these people who thinks you can see earthquakes, not just in Scythopolis when the whole thing's fallen over, or when the floors of, sometimes you can see places like Stobi and Ephesus, the floor has actually gone whoop, and people think, oh, that's a fisheye lens problem. No, it's not. It's the floor is completely broken. Of course, archaeologists going for special pleading. So we've had examples of people claiming an earthquake of a particular date just to sort out their chronology, and that was almost universal practice. However, if you've got blocks that are rotated, if you've got cities full of broken porticos or reinforced porticos with buttresses, as we have in Ostia, sometimes broken in situ, sometimes reinforced, then you're talking about an archaeological trace. One thing I've realised is pretty important is after a major earthquake, at Ephesus, you'll see a horizon of very rough spolia, so a clean-up horizon where everything's off limits. You can't just get some marble revetment. You have to pay for it. You have to ask the city for it normally. But if there's been an earthquake, you'll get walls made out of all kinds of weird stuff and broken bits of statue. And that's one of the key things I see is the appearance of roof tile, which you wouldn't normally use, or shattered marble revetment, just used as fillers. You can get money for shattered marble revetment because they make these opus sectile floors with little pieces. So if you're just sticking marble revetment into a wall, it's because something's happened, something that's shattered that. And often it comes from very nearby. So this is part of my Spolia project. It's not a fool's errand to try and find out where Spolia comes from if you've had a destructive event. It is a fool's errand if you haven't. It's much more difficult. Not impossible, but then you have to get out the measuring stick and you have to go all around the city and you hope you'll find a building that's something like it, and there's no chance. So I think you can see earthquakes pretty well. What about political catastrophes? Can we see the sack of Rome? Well, there's a burnt layer of coins on the Basilica Aemilia, isn't there? But otherwise, Carthage, you can't see the Vandals come in. Sometimes we do find massacres tend to be in forts, not in cities, maybe because then people would abandon the place, and we find the bodies. But that's, in urban scenarios, you have to clean up and carry on. So yesterday's massacre is tomorrow's fish market. So you don't necessarily see the trace, and then we want sort of religious change. Well, that's very difficult.
Right.
I think it might be a bit easier in rural sanctuaries, but there's so many reasons for repurposing buildings. We'll get into this later, I think. And then the visibility of some of the, closing a temple is a significant event. But what trace is there of that? Just simply, right. I'm not saying conversion, but it's closing. Meaning that it's no longer open for religious events. It's still open for social events or for classes or for a festival. So very subtle things might be important mentally, but that's not the kind of thing which leaves an archaeological trace. So I hope that answers your question.
It does. It's very interesting. A few months ago, I was in Antakya, ancient Antioch, in southeastern Turkey. And of course, there are a series of catastrophic earthquakes all across late antiquity with very obvious horizons in the record.
Yeah.
But even now, they're rebuilding from that 2023 earthquake. And you're seeing the same thing, I think, in a modern context, where they've leveled almost all of the buildings that were damaged by the earthquake. They actually raised the street level in some cases. And are now rebuilding on top of these, rubble-filled empty lots. So it's the same thing 2,000 years later.
Yeah, it's good you've seen that. Unfortunately, in the west of Britain, you can't really get anybody to believe in earthquakes, but they're real.
Right. They don't really split columns. If you've got split columns, then they've been patched up with brackets and so on, then, well, that's earthquake. Maybe it could have had other reasons. But if you've got a pattern of stuff, you see, as you're saying, whole areas showing the same signature, then it's worthwhile considering them. Can you date them all the same? Well, probably not, but there may be local reasons, which allow you to develop a sequence in which specific earthquakes then become reasonable with associated stratigraphic evidence. Oh, yes. Yeah, a tangled puzzle.
Yeah.
And as I said, nothing ever remains in situ unless the place is abandoned entirely. So you mentioned earlier your work, briefly earlier, your work at Ostia, and you've worked at both Ostia and Sagalassos, two very different cities.
Oh, yeah.
So thinking about, the 4 centuries of late antiquity at these two sites, how can we contrast, again, speaking very globally, how these two cities fared across the 4 centuries of late antiquity?
Well, Ostia is the port of Rome. It's really part of Rome. It's more like the harbour district of Rome. That does have some characteristics of a separate city. Its fate is obviously tied to Rome, and compared to the rest of Italy, the level of visibility of activity in late antiquity is far higher. So Rome is not just the capital of Latium, but its territory effectively extends across the entire Western Mediterranean, the fringes of. And yeah, you see large-scale building projects. They're not just of one building. I'm talking about secular building projects, but whole insulae, seeing this being several buildings being restored together. Okay, we're not seeing massive structures like the Baths of Diocletian built in Ostia, but we're seeing a level of use of marble, the marble revetment particularly in the 3rd and 4th centuries is higher than anywhere else I've seen in the West, higher anywhere else I've seen in the East pretty much. It's got that glitzy feel to it. But then, it's still got its own particular histories. It's got some things it's drawing from elsewhere in the Mediterranean. It's trying to develop itself a colonnaded street, a main avenue full of decorative monuments. That's not easy because it was a kind of rather grubby port district that had grown in an organic manner. Sagalassos is a medium-sized to smaller-sized, but still very dynamic Anatolian city with, it's got good building stone. So I'm not talking about brick-faced concrete or tufa or travertine at your best, slapping on a bit of marble. We're talking about, you don't just slap anything on it and it still looks good. It's got that glitz, hasn't it, of classical buildings that have been looked after in later. There's probably less building going on overall. Ostia, it's easier to develop anew. The Greek tradition is trying to preserve things, especially public space. In Greek cities, there's this deep attachment to the earlier buildings. So we've got quite a lot of that. However, there are some similar things, the things I've been looking at. If you've got your bath buildings, you've got your porticos, street renewals. It's just, there's also regional preferences that creep in. And lots of shops. So shops is a Near Eastern thing. The West is still going with basilica buildings and macula. But the East has got lots of colonnaded shops, so you get these. That's a big thing at Sagalassos. They've always been rebuilt. It's on a different scale entirely, isn't it? Very different feel. It's a mountainside rather than being down by the swamps, so it feels very different. And it's also, there's more interest initially in aesthetics in Sagalassos. In fact, even into the 6th century, there is in Ostia. There's glitz in Ostia, but it's not necessarily as well thought through. It's constrained by the past in some ways, whereas Sagalassos, aesthetics on a local level, even if it might not be our idea of aesthetics, is still very much present. So yeah, there we go. There's some differences. I could go on. Have you got all these senators nearby? Do they live in the city of Ostia? I don't know, but have you got one rich family left in Sagalassos? Maybe 2, maybe 3, not more than that, I would say, in late antiquity. We still got the blues and the greens. They came up recently in an inscription. So.
Oh, really?
So, yeah.
That's very interesting. I know that at Ostia, many of the old insulae were converted into private residences in late antiquity. Or is that an old interpretation? I know I'd read that somewhere.
It's a busy city. So I've got a house which is built out of shops. So shops converted into a house, or warehouses converted into what might have been a school, which is probably a house. And then we also get some of those warehouses falling out of use. That's also something that does happen. The geophysics on the other side of the river have shown imperial Horia buildings, which seem to be, I think, the 5th century, being built across the river, as if so, in portus. So, the existence of portus is going to change things. It doesn't change things overnight. There's still a lot of Severan building in Ostia, and there's a lot of 4th century building in Ostia. But there are some economic changes which take place, which do have impact on those warehouses. And there's also the question of the residential insulae, if those are what you mean, the flats, to what extent they carry on being occupied. Well, a lot of them are upper stories, so we can make guesses. Occasionally we see collapses, but is that collapse everywhere? How much has been repaired? That's something which has to be still worked on. We've certainly got higher street levels coming in, so when there's a whole building which falls over an earthquake, they put the street level on top of it. That's happened in a couple of places I know of. Yeah, thanks to the work of Axel Geering, notably, who identified that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and leaving aside the very different economic situations of the two cities, you mentioned earlier how one, Sagalassos, lies in the Greek sphere, where there's a different kind of valence to the idea of the polis, I think, than there is to the
Well,
Western
in
Civitas, or
Asia Minor
maybe.
especially,
Yeah.
That's partly because things go wrong earlier in Greece. So in the early 5th century, a number of Greek cities have a shock. Is that the Visigoths? Is that something else? And Macedonia's also already been given a couple of shocks, but it gets a big shock in the 5th century with the Goths wandering around. And you've got Philippi is still a city, a recognisable polis, and so is Thessaloniki, Stobi, a few other. But Amphipolis, it's replaced by smaller fortified entities, which you could call cities, but they're more like castra. And some of those changes also affect the Peloponnese. They're not as badly. Whereas Asia Minor is happily going on. Very well, thank you. And Macedonia seems to get quite a lot of money, or it manages to recover somehow, but it's not looking back. It's looking forwards. It wants lots of nice new churches, nice fortifications. We'll have colonnaded streets, Sigma plazas. Yes, please. Whereas Asia Minor, they don't want all of those things. They're hankering after repairing the old. Let's have a propylaeum, that kind of thing. Let's rebuild our agora. Whereas in the West, they've long been more interested in road paving than the vertical element. And then in the Near East, you've got Greek cities, but it's a bit like the difference between Britain and America. It's like the Greeks get out to the Near East and they really can let rip. Everything is much bigger. It's huge, twice the size. There's enormous temples, enormous streets, enormous plazas. It's like the new world, basically. You can do things there which you couldn't have got away with in your own country, perhaps. Those 4 different regions: mainland Greece, Macedonia, Western Asia Minor, and then the Near East. They all have a different take on Greekness, but there are some regions, notably Western Asia Minor, which combines Christianization, but with this emphasis on the past, on their Greek heritage. They're not going to jettison the Greek heritage. They're going to very subtly Christianize it, not in a phony way, but they're going to make an effort. There may be areas where there is a phony Christianization, but not a phony attempt to reinvent the past, but not here. They're dead serious about both of their traditions.
Yeah, and a segue from this reinvention of the past, you've touched already on some of the features that set these late antique cities apart from their mid-imperial predecessors. And perhaps the most visible, at least to visitors now, are the walls, so many built in the 3rd and 4th centuries especially. Were these simply defensive, or can they be treated as monuments in the same sense as other urban amenities?
Well, I mean, the overwhelming answer is yes. They can be treated.
Sure.
However, these are circuits which tend to be completed initially in one phase. I mean, there's no point having a city wall if it doesn't go all the way around, because your enemy's just going to walk in the easy bit. So there has to be a serious effort. And there are elements of them which are purely military in nature. So protagisma, this little defensive extra wall, which is to permit artillery, and the bastions. If the bastions are concentrated only on one side of a city, as they are at York or at London, then you start to say, oh, well, that's show, because nobody would attack on that side. They want to be seen. And it's true that you see lots of effort around gates, and particularly at Sagalassos, we found the aesthetic effort of aligning the stones, of cutting them nicely, of sorting them by colour, or even reproducing the pseudo-isodomic masonry, which you see also in the Herulaean Wall in Athens, or especially in the gate to the Acropolis, which is 4th century. That's concentrated around gates. It tends to be where it can be seen. And just move a few meters away from visible point, and you'll see compromises in work that allow things to go faster. yeah, I mean, I think it's been well demonstrated for Aphrodisias that in Asia Minor there's a real desire to ape the Hellenistic walls of the sort of 3rd, 2nd century BC, or from 4th century BC, I suppose. And then in other regions, it's much more modern. But we can see across the empire evidence of them looking back to Hellenistic military manuals and copying elements in a kind of a learned manner. So boffins were involved, people like you and me, who were employed by the imperial government and came up with things that ordinary people wouldn't have thought of. Yeah, but there are still regional traditions, and who knows how long a wall stays in use. That's one of the things which has been really badly studied for late antiquity, is when does a wall fall out of use? Is it straight away? We know in a number of instances that the Magister Militum has to come round and say, oi, get rid of that, get rid of that. Because one of the ways of paying for the maintenance is they let people use the towers. So people have rights to use them as workshops, whatever. Then when it comes to a war, prospect of war, you have to get your ditches clean. Even in Constantinople, we've got tombs being built against the wall. So as if, you just get a ladder and over you go, which is no good, is it? So yeah, there's a period in which they are probably not effective, but still greatly shaping the cities. And they may still be in the boasting book of cities when it comes to praising them. You see them on all these mosaic maps or manuscript images of cities. That's a city's got to have its walls, but by this time, not all of them do, especially say in southern Italy, where are the walls around cities there. So yeah, there's a combination of the factors. Yeah, I mean, actual military evidence. Well, you've got arrows at the gate at Justiniana Prima. You've got those nice the siege works from Dura Europos. So but there's not very much evidence for what the primary purpose of the wall was, which was to keep the enemy out. So yeah, there's an archaeological problem of visibility. Intention and monumentality show up better than actual real function.
Right. Yeah, I think about the walls as sort of a visual shorthand for a city, like you see in mosaics in Madaba or elsewhere, or even on coins in some cases. It's a nice way to think about it. And in the same sense, we also see in those same icons often is a trace of a colonnaded street, which brings us to our next thing.
City of God.
Right.
In late antiquity, has to have colonnaded streets with street lamps.
Exactly, and so why is it suddenly that in the East, especially, we see these monumental colonnaded streets becoming the center of public life in cities, or at least of monumentality in cities?
I mean, as I've said, some regions have traditions, but we see changes in those traditions, and you're right, we see an increase in the diffusion and the popularity of colonnaded streets. It's not for the first time. We have had porticoed streets, sometimes with colonnades rather than piers in the West in a few places, in Italica, in Utica, even in Rome. However, there's definitely a very large number of them. And where is it coming from? And I think it's the cultural weight of Antioch at the start of the period. That is driving this, and I think the most important influence on Constantinople is Antioch. Rome, yes, but there's this. I think the cities of Western Asia Minor that we might like them to contribute to Constantinople actually don't contribute much. There's some influence coming over the army roads through the centre of Anatolia to make Constantinople sort of a Syrian city on the Black Sea with Balkan materials. But yeah, this is something that you can see in the reactions of Julian and his brother Gallus in Antioch. They both make comments. Gallus wants to go around the city saying at night with his mates disguised saying, "What do you think of the Caesar?" But the residents of Antioch can see his face because he's the street lighting. He's not used to the street lighting. And then Julian says, well, isn't it weird in Antioch that they let the donkeys wander around into the colonnades? So there are things that they're not familiar with. But despite that, that style is coming through. It's coming into the Balkans in the early 4th century. So by the time you get split, But you've also you get it up at Milan and Gorsium, a few other places. It's coming into the designs it's already present in the designs of forts to a degree. So you might think it's entirely military, but I don't think so. I think it's broader than that. I think it's the Near Eastern urban model which is becoming attractive.
That's very interesting. I guess thinking about Constantinople as the last evolution in the tetrarchic capitals, obviously they're drawing from military predecessors, but also, right, the example of Antioch, the great Syrian cities with their colonnades.
I mean, there's quite a lot of
yeah.
imperial residence in Antioch, both by Diocletian and then by Valens, of course, and Constantine and others. And a lot of monuments built by those emperors, from the Great Church to the Forum of Valens, which you've probably seen, or what we think is the Forum of Valens. Yeah.
Oh, right. Yeah, it's fascinating. But anyway, so to move on, both colonnaded streets and these new walls are often built with spolia, material reused from older monuments. Traditionally, of course, the spolia are seen as a sign of urban decay, that there's picking up rubble and slapping it onto these new structures. But of course, your research suggests a much more nuanced view. What could spolia be made to say?
Oh, well, lots of different things. Sometimes there's an aesthetic viewpoint, which maybe doesn't survive very long when you realise a lot of spolia was hidden behind marble revetment or mortar, so it couldn't actually be seen. And a lot of spolia was put in foundations, as it previously had been. So what are we dealing with? Well, if you look at the total percentage of spolia in walls, as they've done for Aphrodisias, you might find that it's only 15%. It's been put on the exterior face. It's meant to be visible. So our idea that this is somehow index of decline, even economic decline, might be problematic. So obviously, again, I've already raised this after an earthquake. Well, we should be very careful about making. I've made this mistake myself. I've brought decline back out of the box for Ephesus, only to discover that, well, actually, it's an earthquake that's done that. It's made it suddenly horizon in all sorts of broken materials. It isn't just a decline in standards, something more complicated going on. But what important pointers, different times, different places. The first thing we see is in some cities at Lepsis Magna, we've got the use of materials from stores that's never been used but has been kept in storage. And then it's used for different purposes. It looks like spolia, unless you've got somebody like Simon Barker with you saying, no. The joints have never been cut for this block. It's never been used before. So there you've got material which is not in its primary setting, but it's maybe the beginning of the spolia habit. Then later on, you get a mixture of that. You might have new cut paving as at Aphrodisias, but then the colonnades that are well matching have come from somewhere else. That's pretty clear. And it goes on. You see levels of mismatching, and you think, why is that? You think, is this inavailability of artisans? Is this necessity? Is this a number of phases which have got pushed together? There's actually lots of very late repair, which is what being put earlier. Well, that sometimes works. So there's a chronological argument to be had, and then, just to spite us all, we have people in Cilicia clearly building new stuff, imitating spolia building. So back to a fashion.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, I've been trying to look at spolia as a source for urban history. So when you look at spolia contextually, when you look at the whole wall and consider the different uses of material within it, and contrast it with other whole walls, just like you would at other forms of archaeological layers, then can you build up horizons of spolia use? Can you see differences, chronology emerge, which might say how the city is changing, most obviously with city walls, which are a single massive context often, though there are repairs. So yeah, I wanted to get into that to try and talk about cities as a whole from looking at this particular type of material. But I mean, there's a space for other people. If you're interested in aesthetics, go to aesthetics. If you're interested in the economic aspect of reuse, you may find, as Simon Marg has done, that there's plenty of reuse earlier, but you wouldn't know, not unless you're a specialist, either because it's recut or it's It's things like the commenta in mortar. They've been cut out walls and reused again. I mean, is that Spolia? I mean, not the Spolia we're used to. But I mean, yeah, visibility is a big thing. Do we hide stuff deliberately, pretending it's not Spolia? I see that in the 6th century at Sagalassos, only using the Spolia deliberately at the gates to show sculpture reused. So yeah, I hope that gives you some idea of what I'm doing. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, the fiendish complexity of it all,
It is.
this interplay of pragmatism and display. I think of the Church of Santa Sabina on the Aventine in Rome, which has those matched columns that are 2nd century. And I know that they don't know if they came from a marble store or were plucked from a temple somewhere. But wherever they came from, there obviously was some concern to make the nave of that church more impressive using this old marble. Was it just what they had on hand? And, we can't, I guess, entirely know.
Yeah, that's right.
It's fascinating stuff.
I think the best approach is comparative reasoning and not getting too excited by the sort of red flame interpretations which people jump in on. There's often many less glamorous reasons why things change in late antiquity. And I got in trouble with the newspaper journalist from The Guardian the other day because I'm all for downplaying things. I suppose when you're writing a PhD, you have to make things exciting.
Right.
You have to find a reason for having consecrated 3 or 5 years of your life, and you want things to mean things. But then things sometimes do mean things, but you don't spot them straight away. You have to be prepared that there are mundane reasons, local reasons, pragmatic reasons, and that things might not have changed that much in late antiquity.
Right. Sometimes stone is just stone.
Well,
just stone is probably the wrong way to put it. But anyway, so thinking about Santa Sabina and churches like that, I wanted to focus finally on the transformation of sacred space in late antique cities as Christian churches replaced temples. And you mentioned before how it's hard to see when a building falls out of use, easy to see when it's pulled down, for example, or when a new church is built. But speaking generally from the sites that you've studied, how drawn out is this process? Is this a matter of centuries rather than decades? How can we kind of parse the ways to see this happening?
Yeah, well, I mean, temples are part of civic space. They're owned by the city. Mm-hmm. So they're not, whereas churches are not. And we know that though some bishops might try, that generally speaking, the city's accounts stay separate, so from the church, right till the end of antiquity. So the bishop might build stuff for the city, but it's not. So he's not in the same position. I mean, it's difficult to say that to a medieval historian, but Christianity does not achieve the same position as classical paganism in political terms. No way. You've not got leading politicians directly being elected bishop. It's the exception. It's not the rule. So it is a long, drawn-out process. And I don't entirely agree that the churches replace temples. I don't think that they have the same profile at all. And we could talk about that. But I mean, the early churches we know before the time of Constantine, say Juria-Ropos, or there's one in Israel now, isn't there? Now Messene, are they outside the city in the cemeteries? No, they're on the one in Juria-Ropos is by the fortification, but it's inside the city, alongside a synagogue, alongside I think there's a Mithraeum there as well. Different periods, different regions, different time frames. So we hardly notice the transition in Italy. You do notice it in the Near East, where there's been a lot of conflict between religions over the centuries. Destructions of temples in Jerusalem or in Cyrene of different groups, not involving Christianity. It's a regional story again. It's one that's easy to exaggerate and to build on texts alone. But we know now from archaeology that the decline of temple building is much earlier than the rise of Christianity. It's definitely set in by the 2nd century, very obvious in the early 3rd. And I've been writing about that recently. And then the late antique temples, the pagan temples of late antiquity, unless they're in the Romano-Celtic tradition, or beyond the
Interesting.
empire entirely tend to be very small. Yeah.
What are some reasons you think for this pre-Christian decline in temple building? I'm sure, again, it's a regional thing and a vastly complex story, but
Yeah,
what
I
are
mean,
some?
I think everything has its time frame, and different forms of paganism have a different time frame, whether that's civic paganism, whether in the cities with political cults, whether that's
Mhm,
Oriental cults, Mithraism, or if you can call it Oriental cult, seems to come from
mhm.
Rome, and then Romano-Celtic, or let's call it, well, we call it Romano-British here, but Romano-Celtic's better. Paganism. They have different periods, and the 4th century is really good for the Romano-Celtic paganism. They seem to be an expansion, and they come down at the end of the 4th century. Is that because of Christianity, or is that because they're also been on a cycle? Why does the civic paganism go out? Well, I think that people are getting rather fed up of the domination of politics by the emperor in religious terms. And we see a decline in sacrifice. Julian goes on about this in Antioch.
Oh, right.
He's fantasizing about the city turning up with bulls and young men, and they send a goose, don't they?
Right.
So poor chap. I feel really sorry for
Oh,
Julian. Yeah. We see this in all across the empire that temple building is on the decline, and why there are these huge imperial temples, but I think that's part of the problem. If
mhm.
if you go in the temple of Olympian Zeus and see a portrait of Hadrian sitting on the cult statue, that's a bit of a heavy religious atmosphere, isn't it? Maybe there's some other way you would want to express yourself. The Greek temples were the big monuments of the city, went up on the Acropolis in these designated sanctuaries right at the centre of town, and then over time, then it's the Agora, and then it's the bath buildings, the theatres, the gymnasium. Other things happen in the story of the Roman city. And it takes a while for the churches to go back in the centre.
Right.
They are happier out in the 4th century in the cemeteries, which seems to be a 4th century development, going to sit by the martyrs too. So yeah, long story. Many
No,
different
it's
processes.
fascinating. I know
Th-
that even in. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Go on. No, go on.
No, I would say that even in Egypt, I know that we see the same thing happening in the 3rd century. These vast temples that have been, expanded and renovated since the Pharaonic era are gradually falling out of use. And it's not clear whether that's a matter of patterns of belief and practice changing, or of funding falling short, or some combination thereof. But the
Yeah.
idea of cycles in certain kinds of building is very interesting. I
There's,
hadn't thought hard about this before, to be
there's
honest.
literally no rush to turn them into churches. I mean,
No, no.
the best structure for a church is obviously the civic basilica. If you can get hold of that,
Oh,
it's on the
fantastic.
Agora. It's fantastic. You just got to stick one wall in, and you've
Right.
got it. In some places it does, but it's often later 5th to 6th century. You do see some secular conversion. So something becomes a cart house, or it
Mhm.
becomes a finance office or something like that. And then you also see just simply they sit there. They seem to have no use. There may be just part of the backdrop of the city that's monumental, impressive. There's temples in the 6th century in Rome and Constantinople which are being restored, not by pagans necessarily, but just people who wanted to keep them up. So the Capitolium, let's keep the tiles, shining there in
Mhm.
Rome. Why not? It's part of our urban heritage, and the bishops got nothing to say about it.
Hmm. So I know that from legislation, we assume that most temples are closed around the end of the 4th century, maybe into the early 5th century, but they seem to remain either as urban monuments or in these
Yeah.
secular purposes for a very long time before being reused as churches, if they are reused as churches. And what to make of this kind of long hang time between abandonment, at least for pagan religious use, and repurposing?
Well, because the civic space, that's the city's responsible
Mm,
for them, there would need to be a sale, or there would need to be some formal structured transfer to take place. And you can't just go and nick a column, it would seem. Even though they have stories of this happening, it looks from the archaeology that access to high quality spolia is for the civic buildings or the very
mhm.
finest churches. It's a structured process. So I think in many places they were just the ornaments of the cities, and you didn't touch the ornaments of the cities because the Mediterranean people had this very strong feeling that this was their heritage, their public wealth, that no matter what happened to you in life, once you stepped out the door, you were taken care of. This was something you had in common. You had all these facilities. You might live in a miserable flat, but once you put your feet onto the sidewalk and went down to the fountain and listened to some of the kids in the agora doing their lessons, life was okay. Maybe you're going to the theatre in the afternoon, go and have a bath. It's wonderful. So why they didn't want people to knock it? And you see a lot of older statues surviving, not just inside temples, but outside temples, which really could have been recycled earlier. But if there hasn't been an earthquake, just keep them there.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thinking about the city as a space for everyone, whatever level of society you happen to reside at, and that everyone is invested in that sense in the urban maintenance of these public buildings.
It makes the city very stable in political terms. You can see your efforts will lead somewhere. If you invest in the city, it will be looked after.
And thinking about statues, so obviously sometimes statues of the old gods are destroyed by mobs. We have examples of this in text, and we find battered heads with crosses cut into the foreheads, things like that. But it seems pretty obvious that often even the god statues are preserved as works of art, or as parts of this fabric that people don't want to see torn apart.
Yeah, that's right. And there is, I would encourage you, if you see a book with a statue with a cross on its forehead, set it aside. It's hyperbole. It's relying on a text-led reading. What we need is quantitative studies that look at the regional distribution of the evidence. And there's only a few places you can do that. You can actually do it in Cyrene, where there's a sanctuary that's got a lot of late evidence, and there is also a sort of iconoclastic phase where you can work out how many statues may be mutilated in one way or another. But we've got epigraphic evidence to the contrary. Never mind sculptured evidence. When a statue is left in place, people seem not to be concerned about that. So you go to Ephesus and you see that, okay, the statue's been modified. Somebody's removed the willies. They might occasionally remove the nipples from the breast, but buttocks, breast, that's okay. We'll have statues of the gods. That's now called mythology. Let's get them in on Nymphaea. That's fine. Even outside of Constantinople, outside the Senate, that's all fine. But yeah, we have to try and, if we can quantify these things regionally, then we notice different patterns. Some things happen earlier, some things happen later. We have an epigraphic trace specifically of the retail of statues. So these statue groups, which appear, say, in the Roman Forum, by the Basilica Julia, or in Aquileia, where we just say a single name, Hercules, whatever, or in Rome we know who's put them together, sometimes taking them out of the capital. There's a trade. We've got the same guy trading them from Aphrodisias in Rome. They're kind of marked on the base. So they've been handled with the permission of the city. Does that mean every statue has been removed from public view? No, it's a structured process where certain temples say, okay, yeah, we are going to sell that. It might be that there's a local bishop who's pushed that process along. It might be that there's some sort of fight with the pagans, as happened at Alexandria, but Alexandria is absolutely not typical. And then the emperors intervened. But yeah, we know that happened in Carthage, that a statue was pulled from its pedestal and upset lots of people who were arguing that shouldn't happen for secular reasons. So yeah, a variety of ways of tracing this. Again, let's keep some balance. Let's get some comparative reasoning and some quantitative argument, not simply, will this one image, undated act of iconoclasm look good on my book.
Right.
And yeah, ideas that you can simply equate late antique Christians with Islamic State. Well, come on. We don't have to be that stupid. We are in the business these days of writing ourselves just so stories, self-fulfilling, comforting tales that support our political points of view. But that's not really worthy of time in university, is it? We've got to have some sort of idea of the extent of these behaviours And of course, what happens to a statue in Egypt might be vastly different to what happens to a statue in Western Asia Minor.
Hmm. Yes, avoiding that sensational impulse to be topical, to grab headlines,
Yeah.
to
Which is hard for somebody
um,
like you.
oh, it
Because
is. My business is trying to grab
yeah,
attention online. Yeah, it is.
that's right.
But so in terms of something you said earlier about how churches are different kinds of buildings than temples in terms of their monumentality, their civic presence. Could you elaborate on that a bit?
Well, of course, there are meeting which you meet.
Oh,
So
right.
they're assembly buildings, whereas the temple is the house of the god. The courtyard or the forum, the precinct is where people meet for the sacrifice. And a lot of things happen in churches between the services. So between the Eucharist, there'll be hymns for the widows who are getting looked after by the church. There'll be extra long sermons for those interested in extra long sermons, and there'll be charitable distributions or people just meeting, sleeping. You do go to meet in temples sometimes, but I think that the house of the Lord, even the house of the bishop, it has a sort of a different feel to it. Does that change over time? Yes, there's one thing that Constantius II seems to do is to pull hospitals out of the churches and make the charitable provision and systematize it. So you've got the modern hospital effectively in institutional terms, even if not in medical terms. So you get a city like Oxyrhynchus with 7 hospitals. So I think when that happens, the church is going to be much more sedate. If we're pulling whole functions out of it. But then later on, you also get archives happening there, maybe schools, at least bishop schools, things happening, becoming a meeting place, the atrium, to a degree. Not the same as the agora, but still some things. So yeah, they're both monumental buildings. Do they have the same visibility? No, not really. The axial setting of temples or up on the Acropolis, we don't see that same effort made. Churches are obviously more of an interior experience, the setback from the road in atria, things like that. It's a different kettle of fish. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier how it takes quite a long time for churches to colonize the city center, till kind of
yeah.
late antiquity.
Yeah, that's right. In different regions, different time scales, but yeah, it tends to be a bit later. In the West, often they're getting hold of the civil basilica in the early 5th century, or maybe later, a little bit later. So they've done it, but that's because they're getting at that stage they're getting no resistance from the city council, so relatively little, and it's kind of stopping the structure collapse, which is kind of useful.
That helps too. So the reason you think is just this idea that this conservatism inherent in how people regard their cities. They don't want a new building intruding in the center. Or these churches you think prefer to be by the martyrs' graves off in the suburbs, or some combination of the two, I guess.
They did. I mean, the Lateran is inside the city, but on the air, it creates a new focus, doesn't it? And then in Garaza, when you've got this great opportunity to get inside the main temple, they go inside a subsidiary temple, not the main temple. So, we need to get out of the mentality of an architecture of power, etc. We're a bit, little bit too, we're searching too hard for the things we want to find. So it's a mistake to do that. We need to look at the evidence. We can start with an argument and then see to what extent, but there may be other things in there. I mean, obviously things fall to pieces in Africa and in southern Italy in urban terms in the 5th century, even a little bit earlier in southern Italy. So there's more freedom for usurpation, and so you start to see it's a lot easier to do this. Whereas in other places, no, you need to keep within the street grid, you need to respect property boundaries and so on. And we can see that process in places like Palmyra. It's even the churches in the back streets are respecting the grid. They're not necessarily building their apses over the side roads, which is something that does happen sometimes and something you would expect, but it's happening less often than you might think.
So yet again, a local story and many stories as opposed to one
and
narrative.
Don't forget the importance of the city as a civic institution, property rights, the fortunes of other people and their ability to control public space.
Right. Yeah, so moving on, from that actually is kind of a nice segue into the final question, which is perhaps a bit of a red herring. Think about these two dominant paradigms and how people tend to discuss late antique cities as either decline or transformation, kind of mirror how we talk about late antiquity in general, I suppose. Is this just a false dichotomy? We talked before about how this is really a local story that should be locally told.
Yeah, I mean, I have advocated regional decline before. I do think that there is an economic or a politico-economic story to be told of how cities contract, how cities disappear, and that tends to go with changes in patterns of rural settlement, changes in imports, and so on. There is definitely something going on, but we can have. It's a unidirectional decline, which is problematic. Because obviously, as I said, the 4th century, the 6th century, both periods of recovery, in fact, from the last quarter of the 5th century across the Mediterranean. Transformation is a little bit more problematic. It sounds like an invitation to some sort of religious cult, doesn't it? We're going to be transformed, are we? What's going to happen exactly? I'm starting to get worried. What's that involving? Well, mental changes, conceptual changes, of course, yeah. The fact that we're dealing with a church is going to change and not a civic temple changes a lot. What is the bishop supposed to be doing? Is he supposed to be building himself a big palace? Is he supposed to be taking over the skyline? Not really. He's supposed to be looking after his flock. And he's not necessarily going to be interested in the things that we would direct continuation. He's going to be dragged into city council meetings, dragged into resolving petty disputes. They're not necessarily going to want to spend the time doing that. So what are we doing? Are we thinking of universal transformations? Well, I see so much continuity, but I'm a continuity monkey. I'm trying to trace the classical system, what happens to it in institution by institution. So there is new stuff. And war is an unpleasant reality that one has to get to grips with. So those walls are supposed to do something, and that can lead to prolonged destruction. Earthquake is a transformation, but it happens all the time. It's the failure to rebuild, which is interesting, or the priorities on rebuilding. Is there anything else out there apart? Well, divergence. Can we have divergence that we were looking at one story? There was a story of, and then there isn't anymore. So when I see a place like Abu Mina or the Philoxenite in the 6th, early 7th century, everything's new. Okay, it's a new site, you might say, well, it's going to be. But it's not really looking... There's no Spolia. They don't have Spolia there. It's all new built materials. There's churches set in colonnaded streets on plazas, but they're not looking after some old temple or some nymphaeum with statues of the gods in it like they are in Asia Minor. They're not looking backwards and saying, yay, this is the new civilization. It's going to last forever. And then the Islamic armies turn up and say, whoops, no, it's not. But it looked like it was going to... It's one of those moments in history. If you were in Egypt at the end of the 6th century, everybody you knew who would be beautiful, clever and rich would be a Christian, and a clever Christian at that. And you would want to be like them. And you thought this was going to last for thousands of years or until the second coming. And it would taste, smell and look good. Just as the classical city had done, but it wouldn't be backwards focused. So there's an example of divergence. And I think, of course, when the political unity of the Roman Empire gets into going, then it starts breaking up. Then you're going to get more divergence. Yeah,
that's a nice way to put it. I visited once at Justiniana Prima, in Serbia. And so there, of course, you see this rather classical-looking plan, or rather late antique-looking plan with a monumental street in the center and some attempt at orthogonality. There's like a main plaza.
Yeah, not much.
Not much.
Don't get stressed about it, yeah.
They gestured toward it. But then there's also, 7 or 8 churches that kind of dominate the urban fabric. It's built around the churches almost. So
yeah, you do get that.
Fusion.
The Balkans is this other new world in that the rebuilding of these cities, they're leaving behind some old stuff. Churches, fortifications, a little bit of the colonnaded street, but let's not go crazy with it. Especially churches, fortifications, maybe a bath building, Somebody needs to smell good, but not everybody. And good, decent paving. We've still got decent paving.
Yes.
And maybe some store buildings. That's another part of the new city of late antiquity, that you've got to be able to field an army by protecting the stores. So,
but right, we're kind of looking forward by looking back a little bit, but it is still a brave new world.
I mean, Macedonia is a lot more conservative, all that region than Egypt is, I think. But
yes,
but still, it's a different world to Syria and Western Asia Minor.
Yeah, well, I suppose on that note, thinking about this as many stories and not one, we should give our listeners a break and say, just read more about this. And when you visit the site, look carefully.
That's right, especially Ephesus. What date is what you're looking at? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Lavan, thanks so much. This has been wonderful.
Pleasure.
And everyone, thanks for listening.
Thanks. Bye-bye.